Hi, welcome to this video. So I'm going to look at what is Paris Agreement. Now I'm sure most of you had heard this thing about Paris Agreement or something called Paris Accord, which was signed by majority of countries in the world in 2015 to combat climate change. Now, Paris Agreement comes within the framework of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. And then in 2015, this significant global legislation from the UNFCCC comes as what is called as Paris Agreement or Paris Accord. Now, the basic aim of the Paris Accord, or what is known as the Paris Agreement, is to keep global average temperature within certain limits. Now, this is also coming from after series of the IPCC, the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change, and also the global scientific community found out that the human beings, the Homo sapiens sapiens, have been a significant player in the Earth's ecosystem and in the climate. So this was basically targeted to shift that and change the kind of ecological impact that we as a species have had significantly since the Industrial Revolution. So let's look at the Paris Agreement document in detail. On my screen is the Paris Agreement document from the UNFCCC. So I'm going to discuss some sections from articles that I consider as the most important as well as historic in terms of the action to combat climate change. So I'm going to look at the Article 2 first, where you see here it's been marked as. So the Paris Agreement says that holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels, recognizing that this would significantly reduce the risks and the impact of climate change. So where we are now, of course, we have a sense that we are well on our way to cross the 1.5 degree limits, and that is what most of the best science that are coming out from most part of the world is indicating. So what is so historic about Paris Agreement is that the Paris Agreement put this limit of 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and the efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degree above pre-industrial levels, which is so significant for the entire planet, but also much more significant for countries that are most vulnerable, species that are most vulnerable, and also the countries and communities who live in the most vulnerable regions in the world. Now, secondly, another important article within the Paris Agreement is the Article 3, which says that as nationally determined contributions to the global response to climate change. So, what is so important about the Paris Agreement is also that Paris Agreement put forward something called nationally determined contributions. So, this I'm going to discuss in detail soon. So, all parties are to undertake and communicate ambitious efforts as defined in the Article 4, 7, 9, 10, 11, and 13 with the view of achieving the purpose of this agreement as set out in the Article 2. The efforts for all parties will represent a progression over time while recognizing the need to support developing country parties for the effective implementation of this agreement. So there is something called nationally determined contributions, and then the parties who have signed the Paris Agreement will report this annually. That is what is, of course, the COP meetings are also doing annually in terms of the updating of the progress that they have in targeting to the Paris Agreement. Now, the Article 4 is also very significant, which says that in order to achieve the long-term temperature goal set out in Article 2, parties aim to reach global peaking of greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible, recognizing that the peaking will take longer for developing country parties and to undertake rapid reductions thereafter in accordance with the best available science. so as to achieve a balance between the anthropogenic emissions by sources and removals by sinks of the greenhouse gases in the second half of this century, on the basis of equity and in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty. So, this was to kind of acknowledge the kind of differences that would emerge between the developing as well as the developing and the developed countries in terms of their actions to limit their emissions. Now, this is also very significant that I kind of consider, which says that the developed country parties should continue taking the lead by undertaking economy wide absolute emission reduction targets. Developing country parties should continue enhancing their mitigation efforts and are encouraged to move over time towards economy wide emission reduction or limitation targets in the light of different national circumstances. So you have Paris Agreement urging for the developed country parties to take a lead in the kind of transformation that the Paris Agreement is envisaging, which is also so important in the sense that it also acknowledges and recognizes that the kind of historic inequality that exists in terms of the emissions from certain countries, and also how certain set of countries who are the most vulnerable and who have had massive losses and damages due to anthropogenic climate change haven't had significant historical as well as current emissions globally. Interested in knowing more from the Paris Agreement document, of course, you can have a look at the document itself, which is available in the UNFCCC's website. Now, what I'm going to just briefly look at here is that how does the Paris Agreement work? This is again from the UNFCCC's website. So there is something called nationally determined contributions, or as called as NDCs. Now, NDCs are targeted emission reduction voluntarily decided by each country that signed the Paris Agreement. So you would see countries targeting or saying that, in so and so year that particular country is going to be a carbon neutral country in that sense. So these are what is called as the nationally determined contributions. Now, these nationally determined contributions are part of the national policies of every country, where they kind of target and then they reduce or plan to reduce their emissions. Now, each successive NDC is meant to reflect an increasingly higher degree of ambition compared to the previous version. Of course, in the ways in which how countries are pushed and encouraged to have much ambitious targets in terms of their net zero, in terms of their emission reductions. So now, of course, NDCs, or the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, is one of the major tool that work within the Paris Agreement to kind of reduce the global emissions to meet the Paris Agreement targets. There are also long-term strategies within this, where long-term horizon to NDCs, though they are not mandatory or are not forced within the UNFCCC or the Paris Agreement system. And also, countries are also provided with the frameworks for financial and technical capacity building support to the countries who need that. And also, the Paris Agreement reaffirms that the developed countries should take the lead, of course, in providing financial assistance to countries that are less endowed and more vulnerable, while the first time also encouraging voluntary contributions to other parties. Now, of course, climate finance is huge, which I can maybe sometime make a different video. And technology and the kind of technology transfer from developed countries to the underdeveloped and the developing countries in terms of achieving the targets of Paris Agreement is also something central to the Paris Agreement, and as well as the capacity building. And now, of course, not all developing countries have sufficient capacities to deal with many of the challenges brought by the climate change. So of course the Paris Agreement then push an emphasis on climate related capacity building for the developing countries in terms of helping countries to build much more better policies that would translate into a stronger and a better outcome for that particular country. Now there are systems to also track the kind of progress that countries make. So that is also something part of the Paris Agreement system. And now very significantly looking at what have we achieved so far is a very significant question. Now this is also very important because of course we do have uh, 2013 marked as the hottest ever on record, and also we have similarly increasingly some of these years are also being marked for highest emissions ever. Now that means we as global community, despite the fact that we have the best science telling us that the impacts of climate change is irreversible, but at the same time we continue to emit both carbon dioxide and methane in an unregulated way even now in these recent years. So in that sense, of course, what have we achieved? So although climate change action needs to be massively increased to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, the years since its entry into force, which is 2016, have already sparked low carbon solutions and the new market. Of course, now of course I will be making a different video about what is the problems with the carbon markets itself. Now of course there are ongoing progress, but then what we have is that what globally countries are doing is highly insufficient. Now that is the time, or that is where we are in 2014, where we are well on our way to cross the 1.5 degree limit that was kept by the Paris Agreement. And this is what is visible from the most of the best science and the studies that are coming out, that we have, or we might have already crossed in certain parts of the planet the 1.5 degrees, and this could increase into many parts of the planet. Now of course for us to say this, we have to also wait for the assessments by the IPCC. But what is known so far, based on some of the most recent science, is that we are well on our way to cross the 1.5 degree mark which was kept by the Paris Agreement.